It was the summer of 2023 when four childhood friends, Luke, Ryan, Ethan, and Sarah, decided to embark on the adventure they had been planning for years. Hailing from the quiet, suburban town of Charlotte, North Carolina, these four were inseparable during their school days. After graduation, life took them in different directions. Luke became an accountant. Ryan worked as a software developer. Ethan found his calling as a physical therapist, and Sarah pursued a career in education. But despite the distance that now separated them, they remained in touch through calls, messages, and occasional meetups. For years, they had talked about taking a trip together, but with busy lives and demanding jobs, it was never the right time. They had talked about visiting places across the country, New Orleans, the Grand Canyon, even Hawaii, but the plans always fell through. This time, however, they decided to take action. They made up their minds to visit Shadow Creek, a small town just outside of Asheville, known for its eerie legends and mysterious tales. It was the kind of place that called to those with a taste for adventure and curiosity. They had heard rumors about an ancient temple hidden deep within the surrounding woods, a place where dark rituals were once said to be performed, and where ghosts still roamed, haunting the land. The local legends spoke of strange happenings and supernatural entities that had been trapped in the temple centuries ago. They were all fascinated by these stories, and the more they talked about it, the more they wanted to see the temple for themselves. The plan was set in motion. They would travel to Shadow Creek, explore the town, and then venture out into the wilderness to find the temple. It was an escape from their mundane lives, an adventure that promised excitement, fear, and the possibility of discovering something beyond their understanding. They set out on their motorcycles early one morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. Luke rode his bike with ease, while Ryan, a more cautious rider, followed behind. Ethan and Sarah rode together, their laughter and lighthearted banter filling the air as they made their way down the highway. It was a smooth ride, the wind in their faces, and the open road ahead of them, but none of them knew what awaited them in Shadow Creek. When they arrived, they checked into a small, rustic inn, the kind of place you'd expect to find in a town that seemed to have been untouched by time. The owners were friendly, but their eyes always seemed to linger just a little too long, as if they knew something the four friends didn't. After settling in, the group decided to explore the town, hoping to learn more about the mysterious temple. They visited the local diner and asked the waitress, an older woman with piercing eyes, if she had ever heard of the place. "You'll find it," she said cryptically, but not many make it back. At first, they laughed it off as just another local legend, nothing more than an old story to keep tourists away. But the more they heard, the more they felt the pull to visit the temple. They spent the day wandering around Shadow Creek, taking in the sights and talking to the locals. But by evening, they were itching to find the temple and see it for themselves. The following morning, they set out early, their bikes roaring to life as they left the town behind. They had mapped out a route, but the further they went, the more they realized how isolated they had become. The forest surrounding them grew denser, and the roads less traveled. For 2.5 hours, they rode in silence, the only sound being the hum of their engines and the occasional chirping of birds. Finally, they arrived at a clearing, and there it stood, the temple, hidden behind thick trees and overgrown vines. It looked like something out of a horror movie. The towering structure was crumbling, its walls cracked and weathered by time. A strange energy hung in the air, and they felt an undeniable chill run down their spines as they approached the entrance. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would venture into on a normal day. The air felt heavy, as though it was filled with centuries of history, dark memories, and lingering spirits. They walked through the open gates, the sound of their footsteps echoing eerily in the silent temple. As they explored the place, they couldn't help but notice the strange carvings on the walls, ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. In the center of the temple, an enormous statue of a god loomed over them, its eyes watching their every move. And that's when they saw it, the old pot. It sat in the center of the altar, a faded, worn object that seemed completely out of place. Ethan, the most curious of the group, stepped forward and reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers made contact, a sudden chill swept through the room. The temperature dropped, and the shadows in the corners of the temple seemed to grow longer, darker. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Ryan, the most skeptical of the group, stepped forward and snatched the pot from Ethan's hands. "What are you doing? Are you crazy?" he said, his voice full of alarm. But the moment he touched the pot, a sharp pain shot through his chest, and he stumbled back. A cold, eerie voice whispered in his ear, barely audible, "You shouldn't have taken it." "Let's go," Luke said, his voice tense. He could feel it too, the pressure in the air, the way the shadows seemed to press in on them. But it was too late. The dark force had already been unleashed. The group hurriedly left the temple, unsure of what they had just experienced, but feeling the weight of something following them. As they rode back to the town, the air felt thick with tension, and the road seemed unfamiliar, even though they had just traveled them that morning. Back at the inn, they tried to push the events of the day out of their minds. They joked around, but their laughter felt forced. The unease was palpable, and as the night wore on, they each felt a sense of dread creeping into their hearts. At exactly 12:30 a.m., Luke's phone rang. The display showed Ryan's name. "Luke, you need to come quickly. I don't know what's happening, but something's wrong." Ryan's voice crackled through the phone, filled with panic. "They're here, Luke. I think they're going to kill me." "Who's going to kill you?" Luke asked, his voice trembling as he woke the others. Ryan's voice continued, barely audible. I don't know, but they're all around me. They're pulling at my arms, my legs. I can't breathe. Please, Luke, I can't do this alone." The phone cut out, and Luke felt his heart race. He immediately called Ethan and Sarah, and they rushed to Ryan's room. When they arrived, they found Ryan sitting on the edge of the bed, his eyes wide with terror, sweat dripping down his face. "They're here," he whispered, looking around frantically. "I don't know how they found me, but they're here." Suddenly, the room grew unbearably cold. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, coalescing into dark figures. Ryan's body convulsed, and he screamed in agony as his arms and legs jerked uncontrollably. Ethan tried to reach out to him, but it was like something invisible was holding him back. They're inside me," Ryan choked out, his voice no longer his own. "I can't stop them." The figures in the shadows began to move toward Ryan, and in that moment, Ethan realized that they were not human. They were something else, something ancient and malevolent. Ethan, panicking, grabbed a nearby crucifix and held it out toward the dark figures. "Get away from him," he yelled. But the figures ignored him, their focus entirely on Ryan. In a desperate bid, Luke called for help. He reached out to a priest he knew, Father Daniel, who specialized in exorcisms and spiritual cleansing. Father Daniel instructed them to gather as much holy water as they could and to chant prayers in unison. The ritual went on for hours, but it seemed to do little to calm the malevolent presence that had taken hold of Ryan. The next day, they went to the local church, where Father Daniel performed a more intense exorcism, but it didn't seem to work. They were told that Ryan was cursed, marked by the dark spirits of the temple. They had to return there. And so, the group made the decision to return to the temple. They gathered their courage and set off in the early hours of the morning, knowing that their only chance of saving Ryan was to confront the evil head-on. When they arrived at the temple, they found it even more desolate than before. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the oppressive energy that had once been hidden now seemed to be all around them. Father Daniel led them in another prayer, but as soon as he stepped into the temple, he was struck by a powerful force that nearly knocked him to his feet. "It's worse than I imagined," he said, trembling. "The evil here is ancient, "We need to leave now," but it was too late. The shadowy figures that had tormented Ryan for so long appeared once more, their eyes glowing with hunger. The curse was not over yet. As Ryan screamed, Father Daniel worked furiously to perform the cleansing ritual. Hours passed, but the shadows only grew stronger. At that moment, the ground beneath them began to shake. The figures advanced, and it was clear that they weren't going to let go easily. But with the final chant, Father Daniel released a burst of energy so strong that the ground cracked open, and the figures dissipated into the ether. Ryan collapsed in exhaustion, his body drained from the encounter. It was over for now. Weeks passed, and Ryan slowly began to recover. He still had nightmares, and his health was fragile, but the curse had been broken. The friends swore never to speak of the events that transpired again. They never returned to Shadow Creek, and the memories of the haunted temple remained buried in their minds. But they knew one thing for sure. There were dark forces in the world that no one should ever tamper with. And no matter how much they wanted to forget, the memories of that night would stay with them forever.